Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Civil Society Sharing Screen. This is the fifth panel of this series, which is supported by the European Union. The goal in this series is to discuss the recent developments in the field of civil society with the contribution of civil society professionals, members of academia, experts, human rights activists, and you joining us from Turkey and elsewhere. Please visit the website of our foundation to find out more about the previous and upcoming panels, the dates, announcements, and the list of speakers. We will be welcoming new speakers in this panel series, and we hope to see you as distinguished audience in the coming events and coming workshops. Before we get started, I would like to ask a question to all of you. What are the first three concepts that come to your mind when you think of civil society? Please share your answers with us using the chat box. Today, we will talk about the civil society through the eyes of society, perceptions, approaches, and transformations. We will talk about perceptions, actually lack of perception, approaches, transformations, and global trends in this field. We have very experienced and distinguished speakers in this field, namely Ibrahim Betil, and one of the founders of Deep Poverty Solidarity Network, Hacer Fogo, and Ashoka Turkey co-coordinator, Ziyanab Meydanoğlu. Bekir Ağırdır will be our moderator. Bekir Bey, it's over to you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying I am very happy to be side by side with all these distinguished people who are brought together by the valuable Hrant Dink Foundation. We're grateful for the valuable efforts made. I am not intending to make a speech in and by itself, but I have to say that everyone, the spectators, are eager to find out if the new video is released. Everyone is curious, and I know many people are following us at the moment. And these people care so much about the future of their lovely country. And our efforts hopefully serve for good purposes. And you asked us to give you three concepts. The first one is to be a part of life and to give life a good shape. To be engaged in life. To do what? To deal with inequality, unfair treatment, poverty, and to make efforts to overcome these problems. Well, there is also a hidden purpose of this series of panels. The idea is to make people know they are not alone. We're going through the difficult times all together. We may be feeling a little bit lonely from time to time. We may be feeling helpless, hopeless, but we are together in it. And such gatherings give us great platforms to talk to each other. And I believe such initiatives are like a campfire started by shepherds on top of the mountains. Those campfires may look little or small, but the flames are very influential. You will hear more about what I mean in a minute by distinguished speakers. I believe those campfires, when they bring their flames together, they will be shaping the future. There is a truth ahead of us. Based on Conda surveys and research, I should say, on this soil, in our society, membership to a civil society has lower levels than membership to political parties. I think this is one of the things that make us different than the Western societies. More than 15% of Turkish society have a political party membership, whereas the membership to civil society is less than 10%. so far. We will talk about the reasons behind this and discuss how we can increase this rate, how we can generate more energy and synergy out of here. What transformation can we achieve? How can we give it a momentum? Who are our speakers? We have Hajar Foko. Probably you all know her. She is from the Poverty Solidarity Network. I totally admire their effort, Hajar in person and the network itself. And we have Ziyanab Meydanoğlu from Ashokwa, Turkey. You all know her. She is so young, but still, she has made so many great efforts in civil society. And Ibrahim Betil, my brother, no need to introduce him. We have 3 speakers. I'd like to start with a question. But I should say we have valuable participants here. And we have valuable speakers here. Each speaker will be given 7 or 8 minutes in the first round. There will be more rounds, and the last half hour will be dedicated to questions from the participants. Here is your question. Could you please elaborate on the concept of civil society in Turkey, right to association, how civil society is perceived in society? How about philanthropy? It's easier to bring people together around the idea of philanthropy. However, is it the same when it comes to bringing people around the concepts of rights-based organizations or advocacy? That is my question to all 3 speakers. In formal structures legally defined, such as associations or foundations, we have around 130,000 organizations as such, and more than 100,000 of them are based on solidarity, whereas here I'm talking about rights-based organizations, which are quite few in number. Let's start with Hajar. What's the problem here? How do you see it? What is the perception of society? How does the society see it? It's over to you, Hajar. Sure. I will be sharing with you my personal experience. You all know Sulukule area, the Roma people neighborhood in Istanbul. The first time I went to this neighborhood, no building was demolished yet. There was this coffee house, Shukru's Coffee House. And people were talking about urban transformation, but people were not really aware of what they were talking about. They knew it was something about the municipality, but they didn't exactly know what was going on. You know, by the way, Sulukule was the first neighborhood where the urban transformation started. Then we had the idea to set up an association. But how? It would be good to get organized so our voices will be heard more, we thought. And we got together, listened to those people. I told them about bureaucracy and we set up the association and we completed the setup process. And true to my words, we were able to make our voices heard. We were able to receive more information and documentation. That's how I see civil society. It is born out of a need. In this case, it was about transformation in the neighborhood. It was about the condition of vulnerable people, victimized people. And it was totally a rights-based, needs-based effort. That's how we set up that association. And during the entire urban transformation, they brought court cases, which are still ongoing. They objected to the demolishing process. Eventually, it was completed, and people have become aware of Sulukule. And now we have a platform, and we have the association. I think we should also discuss about the awareness regarding civil society. There is the recent law and oppression on civil society. Trustees are appointed on to lead civil society organizations. People are scared, actually, these days. As to philanthropy, it is an individual effort. It's rather about being more visible and having a better position in the eyes of the government, being applauded by the government. I mean, not everyone is doing this in this way, like people get a school built. This is not exactly a rights-based advocacy. In our Deep Poverty Solidarity Network, which is supported by an association, Open Space Association, this is also working for solidarity purposes. Two things happening at the same time. On the one hand, families were given aid during the pandemic. We visited households. For example, we met their heating needs. But along with this, when we identified a violation of the right to have access to education in a household, then we work on that too. Right to heating is a right, of course, but how about right to have access to distance education? That is equally important, and it should be brought to the attention of the public. That's exactly what we're trying to do. There is ever growing authoritarian approach. Oppression is growing, and we're trying to make it visible. The government has started to set up its own civil society. We have been observing this for many years. Otherwise, why would we need our Poverty Solidarity Network? Why would there be a need for human rights association? The government is setting up its own association. The government has its own trade union, women's association. The government is setting up its own fund. Well, unfortunately, the so-called such civil society organizations are serving the government in that sense. While we conduct rights-based efforts, try to make our voices heard. But some people don't think this is important, don't think this is needed, because even this sphere is politicized and we hear less civilian voices. Ziyanab, what is your take on this, the perception in the society? How can we overcome this shortcoming? What I will say is quite similar to what Hajar said. When you think of civil society, actually, three windows open up in my mind. The first one has to do with trade unions, associations, foundations, the big population. Secondly, we can think of it as a space, including the organizations, but all the actions and activities taken by citizens, demonstrations, manifestations, what's happening on the street, the neighborhood assistance networks, signature campaigns. And in the third place, we can think of a common dream. What kind of a society we would like to become? These are the three windows that open up in my mind when I think of the perceptions of civil society. As Bekir Bey said, we should also think of the election map in Turkey. There are, let's say, there should be three different Turkeys we can consider and three different civil society levels. Let's imagine there are 9 boxes, and depending on where you stand in that scale, it changes how you perceive civil society. Can we really talk about a common civil society dream? 6 or 7 years ago, the refugees started to have their own society in Turkey, and it's evolving. So my point is, at the moment, we can't really talk about a common dream of a civil society. Secondly, as Hajar said it so well, tribes are growing or congregations are growing, and these are closed groups. People are very loyal to their closed groups and they're very suspicious or hostile towards those who are not a member of their own group. And we have seen that and its manifestation in the most recent amendment in the law on associations. Authoritarian regime is having a stronger grip. I believe that's the second challenge regarding the perception. We're not trying to blame anyone, but we also pay the price for that. If you're too noisy, you'll have to pay the price. You may be considered as a threat. You may even be punished. As to philanthropy, I don't see a big problem. What is this? This is about the private capital being channeled to a certain purpose. We don't see people criticizing philanthropist efforts. Whereas when you think of human rights-based efforts, that means some people are raising their voice on behalf of some other victimized people. And naturally, you may get criticized from by some circles in the first place. And secondly, if you're doing rights-based efforts, you speak on behalf of others, for example, Sulukule neighborhood. I believe it's much more difficult than philanthropy. And the third point is, I have been involved in civil societies since 2006 for more than 15 years. And there was Habitat Conference in 1996. Then civil society has started to flourish. So it's a Western wind, a modernization wind, as if there was nothing else before that. So what about the conservative associations? They also base themselves on the Ottoman era efforts. That is also a hindrance. This Western view appears as a hindrance. For example, withdrawal from Istanbul Convention. Some people blame the convention in a very unfounded manner. So there is this problem of being considered as a Western wind. Another point is you're not able to determine the agenda and you can't leave a permanent mark, but we can develop strategies to overcome all of these. We can overcome them. And we will talk about that.
Well, this is a very important issue, the history of Turkey, but certain people, they consider their history starts in 1923. Certain people think their history starts in 1453. Some people think the story of history of Turkey actually starts in 1071. So we even have different histories, and when it comes to overcoming such differences, I think Ibrahim Betil has been an important person. He has been successful in that regard. I'm sure he has a lot of important things to tell us. The floor is yours. Yes, unfortunately, civil society in Turkey has not been able to develop that much. We have only 120,000 associations and about 5,000 peace foundations. Well, the number of civil society organizations in Sweden, for instance, is 190,000, and they only have a population of 10 million people. And in other countries such as Germany and other European countries, they have hundreds of thousands of civil society organizations. So civil society organizations haven't been able to develop in Turkey. There are many reasons for this. One is that we always expect the state, the government to take action and do something. When it comes to getting organized, the government or the state has restricted this freedom of assembly and organization, and this crackdown by the side of the government, which still continues even today with the appointment of trustees for the civil society organizations. This is an obstacle for the development of the civil society. A second element is that when it comes to doing something and coming together to do something, people have a need to do that. They have a need to get organized, but this is prevented. Once this is prevented, such organizations are always taking place in an informal manner without any transparency. People are trying to get together, come together to establish associations or foundations. And this creates a lack of trust, a serious lack of trust in the society, a mistrust. And many civil society organizations that are very well known in Turkey really lag behind when it comes to transparency. You cannot see their financials on their websites. It's not announced publicly, for instance, and there are many other challenges. If you send them an email, it really takes a lot of time for them to get back to your email. So such mistrust is ongoing, and because of this informal let's say, type of organizations. And these two issues are the major challenges in terms of the development of the civil society in Turkey. To reverse this, first, the civil society has to have self-criticism. It's not only about complaining. We should not be complaining only. We should be criticizing ourselves as well. If we are to get organized and establish a civil society organization, we need to act in such a way that we create trust in the society so that the society will support us in return. If that's not the case, I do not think that we will be able to develop civil society in Turkey. Well, for more than 25 years, I have experience in many fields of civil society, and these are my basic observations. In different fields, in different topics, people should come together, get organized for a purpose, for a specific goal, totally independent of local governments and the state, and they should always move forward in a transparent manner. I think this will make a great contribution to the development of civil society. Yes, the self-criticism by the side of the civil society itself, I think this is a very important comment. But the society or the community also has some biases. Let me add to that. We also have a historic side. Even the word organization actually implies a negative perception in Turkish. For instance, in English, the word organization doesn't have such a connotation. But in Turkish, when we say organization, it has a negative connotation because for more than 500 years in this land, all types of struggles have always been prevented or oppressed because the state and the government, they have their own type of good citizen or good organization. And especially when it comes to rights-based organizations, they have always been hindered and tried to be stopped. And what you have said is very important, Mr. Ibrahim. Let me turn to Hajar again. During the pandemic, you made great efforts. You were out on the streets almost every day, being involved in activism. So, yes, we do have certain research activities or surveys, but you also have your direct observations. So can you tell us how such civil society organizations are perceived and what do you do, for instance, as your organization to overcome such prejudices or biases? Well, let me put it this way. We are, of course, at the same time fighting against poverty as our network. And during the pandemic, this deep poverty concept, the concept of deep poverty that we had been discussing even before the pandemic, we understood after the pandemic how deep the inequality was indeed. So before the lockdown, we had a survey, but right after the lockdown, we went immediately out in the field and started to visit the households, different neighborhoods. We already knew those people, but I came to realize that I had no idea about what was really going on in the society. And that's how I see it. Mr. Ibrahim also said that we need to also have some self-criticism. That's very right. We shouldn't always be in a position of a know-it-all type of a person or an expert. It's not like when you go to a household, you should act like an expert. You should listen and really try to understand those people living in those households rather than judging them, for instance. So only when we really understand the stories of people living in those households, we will really understand that poverty, and only then we can start to be engaged in a rights-based advocacy. You also understand it's also a violation of human rights. And we try to explain this to our supporters on social media as well. And then we also started to make research about the theory, about the literature of what we have learned out in the field when we visited those households. So, for instance, there was a woman in one household and she had a baby. Then all of a sudden, after we leave that household, when we go to a supermarket and see that they have put some alarms on the baby food, then we realize other things, right? There is an alarming situation. There is an unseen reality that we are turning our backs on. We think these people are poor and they live by social assistance only, but they are also subject to deep human rights violations. For instance, yesterday, a garbage paper collector was detained and beaten up, but we never see these things. We turn a blind eye on these things. But for instance, his wife reached out to us because she knew me for years and she was crying and nobody was seeing his problem. We need to make these things visible, and we need to, all, as the civil society, make sure that people understand that problems related to poverty are also a violation of human rights. For instance, having that baby food, having access to that baby food during the pandemic is a basic human rights. Not having access to hygiene pads, for instance, for women, if you don't have access to that, it's also a violation of your basic rights. So we should be discussing these things. With the pandemic, we also started to combine the theory and the practice, what's happening in the field with theory. For instance, I have a WhatsApp communications with many people, for instance, an important person working in the field of tourism, exchanging information about what happened to that paper collector who was detained and beaten up. So people have now more awareness about these topics. These topics should become more visible and people should learn more. And we should also change our language, by the way. I don't want to take much of your time. No, please continue speaking, because as you have the chance to speak out on this platform, why not talk about it? So how many households did you reach out to during the pandemic? Well, so far we are providing assistance to about 4,000 households on a monthly basis. We are providing this assistance on a regular basis. Well, it's not like we are receiving major donations, but we're trying to do whatever we can to the best of our ability. And on the other hand, we also try to talk about what rights-based advocacy is. We try to talk about and explain people what deep poverty is or what women's poverty is. And we also keep learning at the same time. For instance, when I see a child with autism, then of course, maybe I know that autism is a problem, but when you face the problem of having a kid with autism in a household with deep poverty, it's a totally different problem for you. Or a woman who has cancer, for instance, when she doesn't have access to transportation or food, this is becoming a bigger problem because she is not able to boost her immune system. And then on the other hand, when the landlord comes to get the rent, this is also a violation of human rights. Maybe there is this concept of cancer poverty is something that needs to be discussed by the healthcare people. But if you have autism and if you are subject to deep poverty, then you might have special needs than other poor people or different needs. That's what we're trying to explain to people. And we are also trying to explain this to the local governments or to the public. Social workers go to households, ask people during their poverty surveys if they have a refrigerator, TV, etc. And after 1 year, they get back to that household. But maybe during that 1 year, the household people have been in prison, so they need to take their children from school. And that's becoming a different problem. Let me give you an example. When you go out to the households for the poverty survey, you ask them if they have a dishwasher or washing machine, etc. But the real problem is that woman is showing me her hands because she has wounds in her hands because she has to wash the dishes or do the laundry manually. And then you see her child, and the child's mood is in a vulnerable place. So these are all about basic needs. And when you lack these basic needs, it's a rights violation. So once you realize this, you have a total different perception of poverty. It's not about food or assistance. It's about right violations. So then we tell the local governments that maybe you are helping them with 100 lira. But when we ask those households what they purchase with that 100 lira, they say they can only buy oil, for instance, because oil costs 85 liras and then they can't buy anything else. So then we tell the local governments that there is a rights violation there. Yes, of course, everyone involved in public administration, the politicians, even us, when we use this word assistance, we should be very careful. We should use rights-based approaches instead of using the word assistance. We also need to internalize this. So Zeynep, let me turn to you. Ashoka calls itself a social enterprise network, but there is no reconciliation in the Turkish civil society yet, but you're talking about a social enterprise in such a society. So when you think about this perception in Turkey, or when you're trying to explain yourselves, I'm sure you are facing some problems, but do you think there are similarities or differences between the problems you face in Turkey and the similar networks faced in other countries? Well, this perception of social enterprise is problematic everywhere in the world. We say that institutions such as the nation state are no longer valid around the world, and certain entities, legal entities, are also changing their formats because sometimes they are no longer needed. So social enterprise is a new structure that came up with that need. So it's about providing social benefits, and it gets most of its income from economic activities. But the aim here is not to maximize its profit, but to reinvest again in social issues, problems. So we are actually disruptive in two ways, because we are not under the monopoly of civil society organizations when we are talking about providing assistance, but we are also saying that economic activity is not under the monopoly of the private sector. So now some companies are trying to argue that they're also social enterprises, but it's not the case. But I think as the different needs emerge, things will evolve into a new direction. For instance, in Turkey, we have so many women's cooperatives. They are social enterprises. Or we have guilds, for instance, craftsmen's guilds. These are all social enterprises. I think the number of such social enterprises will increase in the future. And this is a language that the private sector finds very sympathetic, because when you say a human rights activist, they have a certain they are maybe in a way intimidated. But when you say you are a social enterprise, then they feel more eager to be engaged in a dialogue with you. Or like Wikipedia, imagine Wikipedia, it created a revolution in the exchange of information. Or fair trade, for instance, has been a new concept everywhere. And young people are really interested in this. And as we have this crackdown on organizations, people prefer to use such civil society structures to continue to be engaged. But I can detect two problems here. As someone from the field, I can say that, first of all, when we say social enterprise, people think it's a structure that needs to set an example for the private sector, because profit maximization is destroying the planet. So we should work for the social purposes in terms of ethics or environmental issues. We need to have higher standards. So people are showing us as an example to the private sector, but we always need rights-based approaches, because you can't sell the problem of torture, for instance, by selling a product or by social enterprises. So it's problematic to present us as a solution to all types of problems. So we can't say that it's a magic bullet. Social enterprise is not a magic bullet, but people prefer to allocate resources to the private sector. Or sometimes they prefer to support social enterprises instead of supporting a human rights organization, for instance. Yes, one of the biggest impediments in the Turkish society for the civil society is the financing, right? Funding. So, of course, there is a huge need for the contribution to come from the private sector. So let me turn to Ibrahim. He has this professional background and he has worked relentlessly in the field of civil society. So how should we convince the executives, the bosses? Sometimes they call it social responsibility, or they call it a PR activity, or they just establish a foundation so that one of the girls, the daughters, will take care of. But are there also really serious efforts in that regard?
Corporate social responsibility projects are contributed by them, but it's not just doing favor to people. It's about the brand value being increased by such corporate social responsibility projects. If the bosses and the leadership understand it better, they could maximize their profit. The brand value will go up significantly and they will become a preferred brand. And they will get closer with this society. The bosses should have such an awareness. There are research studies in the UK that show us that consumers have certain preferences in favor of companies who are engaged in corporate social responsibility projects. Think of a plastic water bottle sold for 2 Turkish liras. But if consumers know that product contributes to planting a tree or supporting the education of a child, then the consumers are willing to pay for that specific product produced by that specific producer, as long as they're engaged in social responsibility projects. We should have such an awareness in Turkey. It's not just bosses setting up a foundation or getting a school constructed. No, that's not just it. That doesn't solve the problem. It's much beyond it. For example, they could become sponsors for transparent NGOs, support their activities, and this would significantly increase the brand value. I had many cooperation activities with many bosses, company leaders, and as long as you provide regular reports, they become really satisfied and they are eager to give you more support. Transparency and accountability are key here. I'm talking about this as a responsibility of the civil society, not the private sector specifically here. When civil society becomes more accountable and transparent, they will be able to get more from the private sector too, from the companies. Otherwise, it's not just a company setting up a foundation or a school, that's something else. An NGO which is transparent and accountable can become easily eligible to receive such support, and companies would be happy to work hand in hand with those organizations. We need to increase the cooperation. True. It's my opinion that among the companies, many people suffer from environmental, climate change related problems, economic problems, pandemic. And when some companies and brands, if they want to become morally good companies, then they should turn their ear and eyes to the needs of the society. They should share their feeling. This is true regarding gender equality, women's rights, consumer rights. There is higher and higher awareness level in the society, and this will influence the behavior of the brands. But we need maybe new models of cooperation, and transparency and accountability and creativity should maybe increase in the civil society to come up with new models of cooperation. We can't say companies should support the civil society and civil society doesn't have to be accountable. We can't say that. Can I say one more thing? Yes, sure. This is much beyond increasing the brand value for the company leadership. Beyond that, this is a great motivation to the personnel in the company. Employees would have much higher motivation. When their company supports such efforts, the workers will be much more motivated. They will think, we're not just serving our boss only, but we're serving for a good cause because our company supports important efforts. I believe that motivation element is also very important. Very true. Then another question I'd like to ask. In the past year or so, everybody talks about changing generations, the Z generation. How can we understand this generation? And there is a project which aims to talk to the fathers of Z generation to better understand their needs. How can we better understand new generations? Do you think there is a difference between generations in terms of their participation, in terms of their viewpoint, and how they're engaged with the professional world, voluntarism? Do you see any difference between generations, Hajar? Or is it just a myth? Is it so simple? The new generation needs quick fixes. They're after pleasure only. They don't persevere. Is that so simple? I have been in the field for 15 years, and then for the first time, Generation Z increased my hopes, because in our network, almost all of the people who work for the network are quite young, and I learn a lot from them every day. Sometimes I'm told off by them, to tell you the truth. I'm telling you this in a good way. They have such a different viewpoint. Technologically, they are wizards. And in terms of women's rights, child rights, environment, ecology, they consume information so fast. I believe we should trust them. We should walk with them. We should work with them. And we should learn from each other. This is such a grave subject matter. I'm talking about poverty, such a grave matter. But those young people, for the past year and a half, have been an excellent part of this. They are patient, they exactly persevere, listen to sad stories of households. I'm talking about 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, graduates of sociology, students who study psychology or fashion. That's how they are. I think this is about understanding one another. As long as we understand one another, as long as you accept that you can't know everything, as long as you accept that you have something to learn from young people, I think we can overcome this. Because as I said, we work in a very grave subject matter. This is deep poverty. And those young people are coping so well. They deal with hundreds of real life stories. Access to food, access to education. They launched a research survey. More than 100 households were interviewed. They make posts in the social media. They prepare content. Who does this? Those young people do all of that. We have more than 100 young people who are volunteers who come to us and who say they want to be a part of this. So what I'm trying to say is they are amazing. But I should also say, unfortunately, some of us think it's only us who knows how to do things. That's so wrong. Young people should be given a space to breathe. And believe me, sometimes they criticize me, and they're right in criticizing me. On many occasions, they were right, and I learned a lot from them. Once I wanted to display the face image of a household member, and one of the young people warned me about privacy. This was, in a sense, criticism, but he was so right. So I learned from them too. They come up with suggestions, I come up with suggestions. Sometimes I correct them or they correct me. Somehow we find a common ground. They should be given a space to voice their opinions. And we should come to terms with Generation Z. All in all, I'm saying we should turn to ourselves and we should criticize ourselves in the first place. Let's turn to Ibrahim Abi. How about you? I don't want to move the topic to another dimension, but whether it be Y or Z, I'm not familiar with these terms. Who are we talking about? There are millions of young people in Turkey. Who exactly are we talking about? Y, Z, or X? I don't think we can categorize them just because they are of the same age. No, how about their creativity? I believe in the creativity of the youth. Their brain exactly works in a different way than adults. We have to listen to them. That's it. We just shouldn't overshadow their ideas. If you think you should pave the way for them, who are you to pave the way for them? They can pave their own ways. Just stay aside. Don't block their way. They can go ahead. Nobody gives them opportunities. Maybe it's cultural thing. We have a Turkish saying which could be interpreted as youngsters should remain silent when they're with their adults. No, youngsters should speak up. Adults should listen to them. I think today a significant portion of Turkish population is young. And unfortunately, the average age among the members of the parliament is older than 55. Where is the youth? Where are they? They're not in the parliament. Where are women? They're not so much in the parliament. It's all about older male Turkish people. So think of an 18-year-old in Istanbul and an 18-year-old in Siirt, Diyarbakir, or Black Sea City. Can you put those two people in the same category? No, you cannot. Just because they're of the same age, you cannot put them in the same category. If this child who lives in the eastern part, in the remote area, was given a chance, he would make a difference. Nothing would stop them. I think I'm a little bit overheated. Sorry. No, that's perfectly okay. Sometimes I get angry too when we talk about this point. But first, I want to turn to Ziyanab, but sometimes I also lose my temper. I totally understand how you feel. Ziyanab, what is your take on this? How do you see the young generation? I am a member of Generation Y. And when people talk about Generation Z, I think I'm on the same page with Ibrahim Bey. There was a quote which says, quote, youth today is only after pleasure. They don't care about the world, unquote. Well, this quote was from Plato from thousands of years ago. And today we also think same way. So the point I'm trying to make is I believe civil society is not interesting enough for young people. Whether this organization existed since 1994, whether that organization was led by this person, that person, this they don't find interesting. This doesn't attract them. And they see there is this hierarchical structure. I think they are so much interested in activities, activism. They're so brave. After 2013, especially, it takes courage to take action, and young people have that courage. They're brave. So I know young people are not so much represented in civil society, but they do take action. They are a part of the civil society. And they want to be closer to such horizontal structures, such as the one established by Hajar and others. As long as there is the right structure and leadership, they get closer. But they see such an organization as a tool. They don't care about the score, how old that organization, who leads the organization. I think they all care about the need, how the need is met. I think this will also shape the future of the civil society. I think civil society will have a more dynamic shape in the future, a more horizontal structure. So, as if I'm not a part of that generation, this is what my take is. There are a couple of things here. Let's wrap up. This is connected also with the definition made by the Western world. They define generations based on birth years. And you refer to a quote by a famous ancient philosopher. But this time, something is different. This time, young people have a faster life. They're not bound by some time limitations, bound by some hierarchies, by some old frozen structures. They may spend 2 years in this position, spend the next 2 years in another position. The process is much more dynamic for them. The rules are not so strict. So their life is faster. It's not just about birth year. And in addition to that, those people want to feel they exist. This is based on the survey. They think it's not fair. They are subjected to inequality of opportunities. And they see The existing structure is a very strict one, it's a draconian one. But such projects such as Hajar's network and others will change the landscape. We will talk about that in the next round. When Gezi protest broke out, everyone was so surprised by how much involved those young people were. People thought young people were apolitical, but they led the Gezi Park demonstrations. And this was taken by surprise among many people. So I think it's not fair to say that today's youth is only after pleasure. No, that's not true. This time it's different. In June 2021, it's not just like a clash of generations. There are technological advances, changes in the world. These young people have internalized these changes. They were born into these changes. Their mentality and thinking is, of course, naturally quite different than ours. On the other hand, there is a change happening in the civil society too. Transformation taking place in the society. So many people, our distinguished speakers, are very experienced in that. When I was with the History Foundation back in 2002, I think things have changed since then. Transformation taking place. And this is happening in a good way. Capacity is increasing. So let's move on. Hajar, what is your take on this transformation? Are we the same or different than 20 years ago?
Well, I really think we are not talking about the same things at all. For instance, I worked as a journalist 20 years ago, the 1990s, when we had the highest amount of human rights violations in Turkey. I worked for the Human Rights Association at that time, the Contemporary Journalists Association. I worked for them as well. So from that perspective, I can say that in those days we were saying something in terms of human rights, and it was heard by some people. For instance, we would go to the Taksim Square and have a press conference, or when Metin died, we were able to publish a text to protest that. So somehow we were able to speak up and raise our voices. At least it was covered in the newspapers. So civil society was heard. But now, from my current perspective, when I look at it, I can say that, yes, we are writing so many reports, or human rights organizations are publishing so many documents. There are so many things happening. There are environmentalist movements. There are women's movements, for instance. The government withdraws from Istanbul Convention. There is a lot of damage to the environment. So many civil society organizations are saying something, but it's not heard. Sometimes it's like we're speaking to ourselves. We're talking to ourselves. Our addressees are not listening to us. Yes, in theory, the civil society has advanced a lot, has developed a lot, thanks to the technology. For instance, we are having an online Zoom meeting right at the moment. We can have easier communication. There are so many solidarity networks, etc., etc. But when I talk about my field, and when I talk about the story of poverty in those years, and when I think about poverty today, there is a huge deepening of poverty. For instance, we are now able to say that poverty is a rights violation. For instance, those unseen people, invisible people, Roma, seasonal workers, etc., etc., all those people whose rights are being violated are now more visible. We are writing about them. We are posting things on social media. People are publishing their stories, for instance. So the message reaches out much easier. For instance, we're talking about or writing about a family who have no internet, but their story is heard in the social media. We say, for instance, Ali cannot have access to school because he doesn't have an iPad, and this is a rights violation. So we tell the stories of those children, and then maybe a member of the parliament comes up and puts forward a motion at the parliament asking how many children are there who do not have access to remote education. Or we write a petition to the Ministry of National Education and say that there are so many young children who don't have access to remote education. What are you going to do about them? So I'm telling this to Mr. Ibrahim. We have now more openness. We have more transparency. You said that some civil society organizations are not transparent and they are not publishing their financials on the web, you said, but we need to reach out to the public sphere as well. Well, for instance, if there's a problem in Ümraniye neighborhood in Istanbul, which is a poor neighborhood, if the person who will do something about it is the district governor, then I need to go to that district governor. I don't care if he doesn't fulfill his responsibilities or not, but I have to go and tell him that it's his responsibility, that there is a problem and he needs to do something. I think with technology, we now have more means of communication. We can speak up about these rights violations. We can talk about these rights violations in different platforms. We shouldn't be losing hope and we shouldn't be giving up. We shouldn't be thinking like, oh, nothing will change. No, we need to act and we need to be more optimistic every single morning when we wake up. We shouldn't be giving up, and we should also act in a crazy way. We need to keep going to that district governor, remind him of his responsibilities. We need to go to the government and remind them of their responsibilities so that one day they will take action. And these people who are subject to deep poverty, the really invisible parts of the society, we need to speak up for them. Imagine a woman facing deep poverty, facing violence. She doesn't know where to go and she has no chance of getting a private lawyer. So what should we do? We should make her visible. When I say visible, we should support her, stand on her side. And I think these things have changed. Thanks to the technology, I think also. Okay, Mr. Ibrahim, you are the most seasoned and experienced speaker among us who has worked for the longest time in the civil society. You've made great efforts. What do you think about the transformation of the civil society in Turkey in terms of manners, acting, etc.? Well, I don't know to what extent there has been a transformation. I really don't know that. But since the time I started working in the field of civil society, I had a chance to make some observations about the young people. For instance, in 1990s, towards the end of 1990s, young people were working. Well, I can't say that they were working in a different way, positive or negative. 20 years ago, they were also doing wonderful things, very creative things. And young people today are also doing wonderful things as well. When given responsibility and authority, young people really assume that responsibility and they are able to come up with very creative solutions. But if you try to impose something on them, to the young people, it doesn't matter if you're imposing something on the young people of today or the young people of 20 years ago. It doesn't matter. They don't do anything. So I am not in a position to make such a comparison because I have a different perspective. I believe that young people were doing wonderful things even 20 years ago when given the authority and when empowered. And I also know that today, when empowered and given the authority, young people are capable of doing great things and they are doing great things. Maybe there is one difference. Technology is advancing faster compared to 20, 25 years ago. So something they were doing in 5 years, 20 years ago, maybe they do it in 2 hours today, thanks to fast communication. Maybe that's the only difference. What about fundraising or working in different fields. Do you think there is a change or transformation in the civil society compared to 20 years ago? Is there any change in terms of the way they work, or is it still the same type of working? It's the same type of working. We're still having the same struggles. I don't think there is a major difference. Okay, what do you think, Zeynep? Well, technology is definitely a difference that we can observe. On one hand, if they are able to use technology well, and if they have access to this, it really empowers the civil society. But for instance, just like civil society organizations do not go and choose to rent an office from any legal building, we also want to have a different communication with different social platforms like Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, etc. We are establishing our new offices to these social platforms, and we are handing over our information to such platforms. But we are not we haven't realized this yet, but these social platforms are also the new governments in a way. So with digitalization, this also comes along. So we need to maybe move forward towards open source sources. For instance, when Twitter shuts down President Trump's account, we get happy, but it also means that tomorrow Twitter or Facebook can shut down the account of Hrant Dink Foundation. So we shouldn't be happy about this. And now, social media also helps communication in a way that people from remote areas can also be visible. And in terms of actions, campaigns, or short-term efforts with a specific purpose, these are the things that people prefer to be engaged in. For instance, the Me Too movement. People or the masses are getting mobilized in such ways, and I think this trend will continue. And the third element, for instance, something that excites me, and we also talked with you, this can have a potential in Turkey as well. Instead of finding commonalities in identities, we can find commonalities in values. So this helps us to remove the barriers. For instance, there are opportunities for the ecology movement. You talked about consumer rights, for instance. The right for healthcare, for instance, is now more understandable after the COVID pandemic. So between the civil society organizations, there should be commonalities around values and strategies, and they shouldn't be focusing on their differences. For instance, for harassment and sexual abuse issues in the United States, there was a coalition that went beyond the races, for instance. And Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, they are addressing the rights of a specific race, but they have supporters from everyone. So maybe we will see such movements in the future as well. I don't know if you agree, but I personally observe one type of transformation. So you said we should unite around values to overcome differences in our identities. But Hajar, she talked about needs, right? I think the civil society is becoming more local. For instance, we talked about it when we were talking about the young people or the dynamics, certain hierarchical structures that we think cannot be changed at national level. They are there, but we also have organizations working for very local, very specific issues. In one village in Konya, for instance, they are fighting for the olive trees or for the environment or for drought. So when you are fighting for the environment, it doesn't matter if you are Alevite, Sunnite, or pro-government, or if you are a dissident, because it's about values. It's not about your political views anymore. And Mr. Ibrahim also emphasized that civil society organization base with more nationalist backgrounds, they have more rigid structures, and there are legal requirements, right? You need to establish an association, you need to have general assemblies, you need to keep books, etc., etc. But now there is a new trend that is not organize around these issues. They are getting organized at local level, and they are getting organized around WhatsApp groups, for instance, just to get laptops for 5 kids. They come together, and then after one day, they are no longer there because they have solved the problem. They bought the tablets or the laptops for the kids. So Mr. Ibrahim talked about 130,000 associations in Turkey, but of course, we don't have the real figures because there are also informal organizations, but even parents' associations at schools, or they have their WhatsApp groups, or all the mothers have their WhatsApp groups. After a while, they also have the potential to be engaged in activism after some time, right? They can get organized for short term and address certain issues. For the last round, I will wrap up saying the following. For civil society or rights struggles, there is the issue of communication. It might be for the purpose of raising funds, or it might be for the purpose of communicating with different institutions or individuals, society, but it's also for the purpose of communicating with one another. How can we overcome the problems or barriers in communication? Hajar, what are the opportunities that are available for us? Well, let me put it this way. During the pandemic, we initially communicated through WhatsApp or through calls to tell the story. But then, as time went by, as the number of people increased, as the number of people engaged in solidarity increased, circles grew bigger and bigger. And I personally observed that reliability is very important here. Trust is very important. We have the solidarity with the Deep Poverty Network, they believe, but they also know that this money will go to that specific garbage collector living in that poor neighborhood in Istanbul, or that laptop that we buy will really go to a poor person. So people trust in our network, and this really helps the network grow further and further, because apparently people had some disappointments in the past. That's why people had to come up with their own civil society organizations, because people were fed up or frustrated, let's say. That's what I saw during the pandemic. Everyone wanted to do something, but they weren't able to find the organizations that they really could trust. But people want to change something, really touch something and change it. And they want to have an impact. So why do we have civil society organizations or solidarity networks for that matter? Because we all want to do something. For instance, if I want to establish an association, if there is really a need for instance, in the mountains for the environmental issues, we do it. That's how I worked when I was a journalist. I was covering so many violations of human rights. I was so frustrated that I shouldn't be only covering the news of those people who are subject to rights violations. I should also do something, I said. So that's how I switched to the activism part of it, to the civil society part of it. So yes, raising awareness, making things visible is important, and the entire communication should be based on that. We should come together with other solidarity networks and associations. There are other platforms as well. But what we do is that we turn this story into a rights-based story and post it on social media, or we tell it to you, to somebody else. Then this communication turns into something else. It really transforms the way people see poverty. They understand that this is a rights violation. For instance, my child is going to school. He or she has internet at home, but that poor child cannot go to school. He doesn't have internet at home. So people start thinking. They have a higher awareness in a way after what we tell them, after we tell them their stories. So it's not about being engaged in charity or philanthropy and then feeling good about it. No, we want to change things for the better. Or we have certain stereotypes, for instance, oh, that woman, she has 5 children. Why did she make 5 children, for instance? Why did she have 5 kids? No, we're not in our communication asking them, why are you asking this question? But we tell people, okay, let's discuss this. Let's try to find a solution together. And then some people are biased, saying, oh, those poor people are too lazy to work. They don't even look for jobs. But then we ask, for instance, if it's a public official who says this, we tell them, did you give them a job? For instance, maybe they have a health problem, a herniated disc. That's why they cannot work, for instance. But did you ever ask them? We tell them. So we believe that we need to be engaged in a different communication, and we need to use a different language with them. That's what we are trying to do when we post things on social media, when we communicate with the households in the field. We use a different language because we have been able to establish that trust. It's not like, oh, they came here and then they went. Or they will not think that, oh, we will be receiving all those food aids eternally. No, we also direct them to the relevant institutions and organizations. We tell them about their rights. We guide them. We also try to change the language that is spoken there, so it's a more rights-based language. So we teach these things to the public, to the media, to the public opinion, and we also learn. We want these concepts to be changed, and social rights should be the language, the concept that we should be using, so that we will have more sustainable projects. Okay, Mr. Ibrahim, before you leave, because I think you'll have to leave, what would you like to say about this problem of communication by the side of the civil society? We need to explain ourselves to the donors and to the civil society, right? I think the most important thing is that every single civil society organization, they need to know how many people they reach out to as a result of their activities. They should explain and announce this not only to the donors, but to the entire community, to the entire society. They need to take steps to do that. It's not like, yes, you are donating this money to me and I'm doing wonderful things. No, we should be raising awareness in people who are not donors. We need to explain people the impact of our work, the impact that we create. And of course, for that, we need to be able to measure the impact. I think this is one of the most important steps for communication. We need to be telling people concretely what we are doing. So as the civil society organizations do this, they will get more support and more trust. And they shouldn't be expressing themselves to the donors only, to the volunteers only, but to the public officials as well. Because if there is something done at local level, for instance, you need to inform the local government, the district government, or the governor's office. Because information provided to the governor's office reaches out to the higher echelons. For instance, it also reaches the Ministry of Interior, other ministries, and they see all those wonderful things done by the local NGOs or civil society organizations. So the government also has more trust in the organizations. I have seen so many examples of this. I have so many stories to share with you, but we don't have the time to talk about them. But just as a recommendation, I want to talk about this. Okay. We will say goodbye to you because we know you have another meeting. Okay, Zeynep, what do you do for the communication of Ashoka? Well,
including for Ashoka, social entrepreneurship, I should say it's about social entrepreneurship. What we are not, so many words we can say. We are a social entrepreneurship organization. This is a usually people use negative words to describe what they are not, who they are not. They are non-governmental, non-profit. I think it would be easier the other way around. We should use words in a more careful way. This is a social entrepreneurship organization. I think the word beneficiary, the word target group or a stakeholder. I think we should be more careful in terms of the words we use, we choose. A part of it has to do with militarism, terminology coming from the army, some terminology coming from the private sector. I think we should read between the lines. These words come from different spheres, and we should use the civil society's language. So we define ourselves as social entrepreneurship organization. Let me give you another example. Sometimes we sanctify donors. We sometimes call them supporters or dream partners. We talk about people who give you money. Do they give you something else than money? It's very rare. I don't want to be cynical, but that's the reality at the end of the day. No need to sanctify or make some targets, some groups sacred. No need to belittle other segments. We should use simple language, simple words. No need to borrow words from other sectors and industries. We should maybe borrow from the nature if we have to. We should come up with our own words. If necessary, we can use some old Turkish words. We don't have to be so secular in language sense, I mean in the Turkish context. For example, the word örgüt means organization in Turkish. We should maybe be careful with the words we use. In Armenian, there is this word, which is great, which we haven't heard of. There is a social entrepreneur who lives in the Middle Eastern Black Sea region. I learned new words from that person too. I mean, we should find different ways to describe our activities. The other speaker said the first thing you need to do in communication is to listen to the other. Turn a very careful ear. Whether you talk about social rights or social entrepreneurship, no matter what you're talking about, first you should stop and listen. You should listen to the field. And you should choose a careful language to make it simpler. I totally agree. The language we use is very important. Recently, we talk about climate change, trying to increase awareness in Turkey regarding climate change. Many research initiatives are in place. We launched many. And the thing is, there's a problem with the jargon we use. We don't use a common jargon, and that's a problem. People on the street use a different jargon than some researchers. In my village, there were 4 little streams, not rivers, but streams. Not these days, nobody talks about streams. When you talk about climate change per se to my 90-year-old mother living in the village, he may not know those words as climate change. Maybe she expresses the same problem, the same crisis with other words that belong to that village. If you ask her about what happened to those streams, she could tell you all about climate change. We don't have a common jargon. And this also have a political dimension too. We need to be sincere in the language choice, the word choice we make. For the past hour and a half, we all talk about the word right, rights. But people on the street refer to that as justice. And we exactly mean the same thing. Language is so important. It can't be overemphasized. I think now is the time to turn to the audience. They may have some questions or may want to make some comments. It's your turn. Or maybe I should check with the moderators Have you received questions yet? I think there's no question typed in the chat, no hands raised so far. Then I think we can finish. The one question typed in the chat box. Shall I read it out for you? Yes, please. Here's the question regarding representation of civil society in the media. What is the influence of this representation in the public opinion? Civil society perception in the media. Is that it? Hajar, would you like to answer that question? And we want to turn this into a creative disruption. We need to bring our forces together. We should stand side by side. We need new models. And we should walk together. We shouldn't look into each other's eyes. We should stand side by side, and we should look into future, standing side by side. Otherwise, if we keep looking at each other, looking into each other's eyes, that might be boring, right? No, we should stand side by side and look into the future together. There's a popular slogan in the social media. Let me quote that. Justice, rights, and democracy. That is what we want. That is our hope. There's no reason to fail. And including Ibrahim Abi and all three of you, you never give up. You are symbols of perseverance. And bravo, I have to say, this is excellent. This is amazing effort on your side. But the people of this country deserve a big applause too, truly. I think we can achieve it together, hand in hand, because we deserve it. So that's how I would like to end this panel. I'd like to thank our speakers and the foundation colleagues for making this possible, giving us a chance to speak to the distinguished audience. Thank you very much.